January 20th, 1953, Washington, D.C. The bitter January wind whipped across the Capitol steps as President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower stood rigid in his formal morning coat, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack granite. Behind him, the man who had made this moment possible sat slumped in his wheelchair, his trembling hands folded across a lap blanket, watching the ceremony that would mark the end of their friendship forever. What Harry S. Truman didn't realize as he witnessed Eisenhower take the oath of office was that this moment would trigger 8 years of complete silence between two men who had once trusted each other with the fate of the free world. The roots of their destruction lay not in grand political disagreements or strategic failures, but in a series of personal betrayals that began in the spring of 1952 and culminated on this frozen January morning. Eisenhower's face, carved from years of command and compromise, betrayed no emotion, as Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the presidential oath. But those who knew him best recognized the telltale signs of his legendary temper held under iron control: the slight twitch at the corner of his left eye, the way his fingers drummed silently against his leg, the deliberate slowness of his responses. This was a man who felt profoundly wronged, and Harry Truman, sitting just 15 feet behind him, was the source of that wound. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The betrayal had begun 8 months earlier, during the height of the 1952 presidential campaign, when Truman made a decision that would forever alter his relationship with the general he had once called his most trusted advisor. On June 5th, 1952, at a private dinner in the White House family quarters, Truman had looked across the table at Eisenhower and made what he believed was a generous offer. "Ike," Truman had said, cutting into his Kansas City steak with deliberate precision, "I want you to know that if you decide to run for president on the Democratic ticket, you'll have my full support. Complete endorsement, the party machinery, the fundraising apparatus, everything." The offer hung in the air like smoke from Truman's ever-present cigarette, waiting for a response that would change everything. Eisenhower had set down his fork carefully, his blue eyes studying Truman's face for any sign of jest or political maneuvering. Finding none, he had responded with characteristic directness. "Mr. President, I appreciate the offer more than you know, but I've given my word to the Republican leadership. I can't go back on that commitment, regardless of the personal cost." Truman's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes that Eisenhower recognized as disappointment mixed with something else, something that would later reveal itself as the beginning of resentment. What neither man understood in that moment was that this conversation would become the foundation of a mutual sense of betrayal that would poison their relationship for the remainder of their lives. Truman interpreted Eisenhower's refusal as ingratitude, a rejection not just of political alliance but of personal loyalty. In Truman's view, he had elevated Eisenhower from a relatively unknown staff officer to Supreme Allied Commander, had given him the largest military command in American history, and had treated him as both a trusted advisor and a surrogate son. The rejection felt like a slap across the face from someone he had considered family. Eisenhower, for his part, began to see Truman's offer as political manipulation disguised as friendship. The general who had spent his entire career avoiding political entanglements suddenly found himself questioning whether their relationship had ever been based on genuine respect or merely Truman's calculation of political advantage. The seeds of suspicion, once planted, would grow throughout the summer and fall of 1952, nourished by campaign rhetoric and media speculation. The first public crack in their relationship appeared during a campaign stop in Denver on September 15, 1952. Eisenhower, speaking to a crowd of 12,000 supporters packed into the Red Rocks amphitheater, made what many observers considered a calculated political attack on Truman's handling of the Korean War. "The current administration," Eisenhower declared, his voice carrying clearly across the natural stone formation, has failed to provide our fighting men with a clear strategy for victory. They have been asked to fight a limited war with unlimited casualties, and the American people deserve better. The speech, covered extensively by radio and newspaper reporters, reached Truman within hours. Sitting in the Oval Office that evening, reading transcripts of Eisenhower's remarks, Truman felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart exactly, but something deeper and more permanent. The man he had trusted to win World War II was now using military credibility that Truman had helped build to attack his presidency. The betrayal felt complete and irreversible, but the personal attacks were only the beginning. As the campaign intensified through October and November, both men found themselves trapped in a political dynamic that demanded increasingly harsh rhetoric. Eisenhower, despite his natural inclination toward diplomatic language, was pressed by his advisers to draw sharper distinctions between his leadership style and Truman's record. Truman, watching his chosen successor, Adlai Stevenson, struggle against Eisenhower's popularity, felt compelled to defend his legacy with increasing vigor. The breaking point came on November 8, 1952, 3 days after Eisenhower's decisive electoral victory. Truman, in what he later described as an attempt at gracious transition planning, called Eisenhower personally to discuss the transfer of power. The conversation, which lasted barely 5 minutes, would become the last direct communication between the two men for over 7 years. According to Truman's diary, recovered decades later from his presidential library, the conversation went disastrously wrong from the opening seconds. "Congratulations, General." Truman had begun, using the military title that Eisenhower preferred. "I want you to know that I'm committed to the smoothest possible transition. Whatever you need from my administration, you'll have my complete cooperation." Eisenhower's response, as recorded in Truman's careful handwriting, was curt to the point of rudeness. "Mr. President, I appreciate the call. My staff will coordinate with yours on the necessary arrangements." The conversation ended there, with no discussion of policy, no exchange of pleasantries, no acknowledgement of their shared history. Truman, sitting alone in the Oval Office after hanging up the telephone, realized that something fundamental had changed between them. The warm relationship, built over 7 years of collaboration, had been replaced by cold formality. But what hurt most was the sense that Eisenhower seemed eager to distance himself from any association with the Truman presidency, as if their partnership had been a political liability to be discarded, rather than a historical achievement to be celebrated. The transition period that followed, from November 1952 through January 1953, became a masterclass in political courtesy, masking personal animosity. Both men understood their public obligation to demonstrate smooth democratic governance, but their private interactions were marked by careful avoidance and deliberate distance. Eisenhower attended the required briefings but asked no questions that weren't absolutely necessary. Truman provided the mandated information but offered no additional insights or personal guidance. The most telling incident occurred during the final transition meeting, held in the Cabinet Room on January 15, 1953, just 5 days before the inauguration. Eisenhower arrived precisely on time, accompanied by his chief advisor Sherman Adams and his designated Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Truman waited with Secretary of State Dean Acheson and White House Chief of Staff John Steelman. The meeting, scheduled for 2 hours, lasted exactly 90 minutes. No refreshments were served. No personal conversation occurred before or after the formal agenda. When it ended, Eisenhower stood, shook Truman's hand once, and left without a word beyond, "Thank you, Mr. President." Truman, watching through the cabinet room windows as Eisenhower's car departed the White House grounds, felt the full weight of what their relationship had become. These were not two political opponents conducting routine business. These were former friends and collaborators treating each other as strangers. The realization that their partnership had not survived the transition from military alliance to political competition left Truman feeling hollow in a way that defeat never had. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the true devastation was yet to come. On January 19th, the day before the inauguration, Truman made what he intended as a final gesture of friendship and respect. He personally wrote a letter to Eisenhower, designed to be delivered privately on inauguration morning. The letter, discovered years later in Eisenhower's personal papers, revealed the depth of Truman's hurt and his desperate hope for reconciliation. "Dear Ike," the letter began, written in Truman's characteristic blue fountain pen ink, "Tomorrow you become President of the United States, and I want you to know that despite our recent difficulties, you have my prayers and my hopes for success. The office you're about to assume is the loneliest job in the world, but also the most rewarding. Whatever our political differences, I hope you know that my respect for you as a man and as a leader remains unchanged." The letter continued for 2 pages, mixing practical advice about presidential responsibilities with personal reflections on their shared experiences during the war years. Truman wrote about the weight of decision-making that Eisenhower would soon feel, the isolation that comes with ultimate authority, and the importance of maintaining perspective during moments of crisis. Most significantly, he concluded with an offer that revealed his continuing hope for their friendship. "The door of my home in Independence will always be open to you, not as former presidents, but as friends who shared the burden of leading this nation through difficult times." Eisenhower received the letter in his suite at the Statler Hotel on the morning of January 20th. According to his personal aide, Kevin McCann, who was present when the letter arrived, Eisenhower read it twice, set it aside without comment, and never mentioned it again. The letter was found decades later, filed among routine correspondence with no indication that it had ever been answered or acknowledged. This silence spoke volumes about Eisenhower's state of mind as he prepared for the inauguration ceremony. The general who had built his reputation on decisive action and clear communication was paralyzed by conflicting emotions he couldn't resolve. His respect for Truman's service remained genuine, but his sense of political betrayal ran equally deep. Unable to reconcile these feelings, he chose silence as the safest path forward. The inauguration ceremony itself became a public display of private dysfunction. Tradition dictated that the outgoing president and president-elect would ride together from the White House to the Capitol, sharing a car and engaging in friendly conversation that symbolized democratic continuity. Instead, Truman and Eisenhower sat in stony silence throughout the 20-minute journey, both men staring straight ahead as crowds lined Pennsylvania Avenue to witness the transfer of power. The only recorded conversation during the ride concerned practical logistics. When their car stopped at a traffic light near the Treasury building, Truman mentioned that he had left a bottle of bourbon in the presidential desk drawer, a tradition dating back to Franklin Roosevelt. Eisenhower nodded acknowledgement but offered no response. When they arrived at the Capitol, both men exited the car without looking at each other, walking up the steps side by side but maintaining careful distance. As Eisenhower raised his right hand to take the presidential oath, Harry Truman sat in his designated seat, watching the ceremony that marked not just the end of his presidency, but the end of a relationship that had once been central to his understanding of leadership and loyalty. The irony was overwhelming. The man who had trusted Eisenhower with the largest military command in American history was now watching that same man assume the presidency while treating him like a political enemy rather than a mentor and friend. The oath completed, President Eisenhower turned to face the crowd of 50,000 people gathered on the Capitol grounds. His inaugural address, carefully crafted over weeks of preparation, made no reference to the Truman administration's achievements, no acknowledgement of the Marshall Plan, the NATO alliance, the successful conclusion of World War II, or the difficult decisions that had shaped the post-war world. For a man who had once praised Truman as one of the greatest presidents in American history, the omission felt deliberate and devastating. Truman, listening to the speech from his seat on the platform, felt each non-reference like a physical blow. This was not just political positioning, this was personal erasure. The man who had elevated Eisenhower from obscurity to global prominence was now being written out of the narrative of American leadership. The message was clear. The Eisenhower presidency would define itself in opposition to, rather than in continuation of, the Truman legacy. The inauguration ceremony concluded with military precision, but beneath the surface pageantry lay the wreckage of a relationship that had once symbolized everything noble about American leadership. As President Eisenhower delivered his final remarks and the crowd began to disperse, Harry Truman found himself standing alone on the Capitol platform, watching his successor work the receiving line with practiced efficiency. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Eisenhower, energetic and forward-looking, surrounded by well-wishers and political allies. Truman, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years, isolated and forgotten in the midst of celebration. What made this moment particularly devastating was the weight of shared history that now seemed meaningless. These were not ordinary politicians conducting a routine transfer of power. These were two men who had quite literally saved Western civilization together. In the summer of 1944, when the fate of democracy hung in the balance, it was Truman who had given Eisenhower absolute authority to launch Operation Overlord. When political pressure mounted to replace Eisenhower after the costly setbacks in the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge, it was Truman who had stood firm against his critics. When Eisenhower needed additional resources for the final push into Germany, it was Truman who had fought Congress to provide them. The irony cut deeper because their collaboration had been born not of political calculation but of genuine mutual respect forged in the crucible of global conflict. In 1945, when Truman suddenly became president after Roosevelt's death, it was Eisenhower who had provided steady counsel during the most difficult decisions of the war's end. The choice to use atomic weapons against Japan, the decision to allow Soviet forces to take Berlin, the complex negotiations over post-war occupation zones, all had been shaped by their partnership. Yet now, 8 years later, they could not even maintain eye contact during a public ceremony. The silence that descended between them after Inauguration Day was not the comfortable quiet of old friends who understood each other without words. It was the hostile silence of wounded pride and unforgivable betrayal. In the weeks following the ceremony, Washington's political establishment watched in amazement as two of America's most prominent leaders acted as if the other no longer existed. At state dinners where both were present, they would carefully avoid any proximity. At public events, they would time their arrivals and departures to minimize contact. Even their staff members received implicit instructions never to mention one man's name in the presence of the other. The deeper tragedy was that this silence occurred precisely when American leadership faced its greatest challenges since the war. The Soviet Union was developing hydrogen weapons. The Korean conflict continued to claim American lives. NATO alliance required delicate management. China was emerging as a communist threat. Yet the two men who possessed more combined experience in managing global crises than any other Americans alive were unable to speak to each other about the very challenges they had once faced together. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had served as a bridge between both men, watched their estrangement with growing alarm. In his private diary, Acheson wrote with characteristic bluntness, "The spectacle of Truman and Eisenhower, maintaining this childish silence while the world burns around us, is both tragic and dangerous. These are not ordinary men nursing ordinary grudges. They are the architects of American victory in the greatest war in human history, and their wisdom is desperately needed. Instead, They sulk like schoolchildren, while democracy faces its greatest peacetime test. The silence became particularly painful during moments of national crisis that demanded the kind of experienced leadership both men could provide. During the 1956 Suez Crisis, when American allies Britain and France invaded Egypt without consultation, Eisenhower faced the most complex foreign policy challenge of his presidency. The decision to oppose American allies in favor of international law required exactly the kind of bold judgment that Truman had demonstrated during the Berlin airlift crisis of 1948 through 49. Yet, Eisenhower made these decisions in isolation, unable to consult the one man who had faced similar pressures under similar circumstances. Truman, watching the crisis unfold from his retirement in Independence, Missouri, found himself crafting mental letters to Eisenhower that he would never send. His private papers, discovered decades later, revealed detailed analyses of the Suez situation that demonstrated his continuing engagement with global affairs. "Ike is handling this correctly," Truman wrote in his diary on November 2, 1956. "But he's taking unnecessary risks by not building stronger congressional support before acting. A private conversation could help him avoid the political mistakes I made during Korea." The letter was never written. The advice was never offered. The silence continued. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 presented an even more devastating example of their enforced separation. When Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian freedom fighters in Budapest, Eisenhower faced the agonizing decision of whether to risk nuclear war by intervening militarily on behalf of democracy. This was precisely the kind of moral and strategic dilemma that Truman had confronted when deciding whether to support Greece and Turkey against Soviet pressure in 1947. Truman's experience with the Truman Doctrine could have provided invaluable guidance for Eisenhower's response to Hungary. Instead, both men suffered through the crisis alone, each knowing that the other possessed insights that could help, but neither willing to bridge the gap that pride had created between them. The human cost of their silence extended beyond policy-making into the realm of personal suffering. Truman, despite his reputation for resilience, was deeply affected by the loss of Eisenhower's friendship. Bess Truman, observing her husband's struggle with depression during the mid-1950s, wrote to her daughter Margaret, "Your father tries to hide it, but losing Ike's respect has wounded him more than any political defeat ever could. He talks about the war years sometimes, remembering conversations they had about leadership and duty, and I can see him wondering where that mutual understanding went." Eisenhower faced his own private torment. Despite his public image of serene confidence, those closest to him recognized signs of regret and longing for the clarity that his relationship with Truman had once provided. His personal physician, Dr. Howard Snyder, noted in his medical records that Eisenhower's stress levels consistently elevated during events that reminded him of his wartime collaboration with Truman. "The president seems to carry a burden that he cannot discuss," Dr. Snyder wrote in 1957. "He speaks often of decisions made in partnership during the war, but never mentions his current isolation in making similar decisions alone." The broader tragedy was that their silence occurred during a period when America desperately needed the kind of bipartisan leadership they could have provided together. The Cold War required sustained commitment across multiple presidential administrations. The civil rights movement demanded moral authority that transcended party politics. The space race needed the kind of bold vision that had characterized their wartime collaboration. Yet these challenges were met by a political system fractured by the personal animosity between two of its most experienced leaders. Their silence also deprived the American people of a powerful symbol of democratic continuity. During World War II, the Truman-Eisenhower partnership had demonstrated that American leadership could transcend personal and political differences when democracy itself was at stake. Their collaboration had shown the world that democratic societies could produce leaders capable of both decisive action and collaborative wisdom. The destruction of that partnership sent a different message, that even the most successful democratic leaders were ultimately prisoners of their own pride and political calculation. The missed opportunities were particularly poignant, because both men continued to face challenges that their shared experience could have illuminated. When Eisenhower struggled with congressional opposition to his foreign aid programs, Truman's experience with the Marshall Plan could have provided crucial guidance. When Truman wrote his memoirs and faced criticism of his wartime decisions, Eisenhower's military perspective could have strengthened his historical legacy. When both men faced heart attacks in the late 1950s, their shared understanding of leadership under physical stress could have provided mutual support. Instead, they endured these challenges in isolation, each knowing that the other possessed understanding that could help but neither willing to reach across the chasm that separated them. The silence was finally broken, ironically, by a tragedy that neither man could have anticipated. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The funeral, held 3 days later, required the presence of all living former presidents. For the first time in over 10 years, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower found themselves in the same place at the same time, united by grief for a leader whose death reminded them both of the fragility of democratic leadership. The encounter, brief though it was, revealed how much both men had aged under the burden of their estrangement. Truman, now 79 and walking with difficulty, looked frail and diminished. Eisenhower, 73 and still recovering from his heart attack, appeared tired and uncertain. When they met outside St. Matthew's Cathedral before the funeral service, their conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but witnesses reported that both men seemed to recognize something in each other that had been lost during their years of silence. "Harry," Eisenhower said, extending his hand with visible effort, "this is a terrible day for the country." Truman, taking the offered hand, responded with characteristic directness. The exchange was brief, formal, and careful, but it marked the first civil words they had spoken to each other since January 19, 1953. Standing together in their formal mourning attire, they looked like what they were: two old men who had once saved the world together and had spent a decade learning to regret their inability to remain friends. The Kennedy funeral did not restore their friendship, but it did provide a moment of recognition that their estrangement had cost both men something essential. In the months that followed, neither man spoke publicly about their brief encounter, but both seemed to carry themselves with slightly less rigidity when the other's name was mentioned in their presence. The wall of silence remained, but it had developed small cracks through which glimpses of their former relationship could occasionally be seen. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, his passing marking the end of an era in American leadership. Truman, now 84 and in declining health himself, was too ill to attend the funeral, but he issued a public statement that revealed the depth of his continuing respect for his former friend and collaborator. "General Eisenhower," Truman's statement read, "was one of the great military leaders in American history and a president who served his country with distinction. Our disagreements were political, our shared commitment to democracy was eternal." The statement was Truman's final attempt to bridge the gap that had separated them for 16 years, but it came too late for reconciliation. When Truman himself died on December 26, 1972, he took with him the hope that their partnership might somehow be remembered for its achievements rather than its ultimate failure. The two men who had stood together against fascism, who had built the foundation of America's post-war global leadership, who had demonstrated that democracy could produce leaders capable of both courage and wisdom, had never been able to forgive each other for being human. Their story stands as both an inspiration and a warning about the nature of leadership in democratic societies. The same qualities that enabled them to work together successfully during wartime their strong convictions, their unwillingness to compromise core principles. Their deep sense of personal honor also made it impossible for them to maintain their friendship when those principles came into conflict. Democracy had produced two extraordinary leaders, but democracy had also created the political pressures that ultimately destroyed their partnership. In the end, the silence between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower reminds us that even the greatest leaders are shaped by the same human frailties that affect us all. Pride, disappointment, wounded feelings, and misunderstood motives can destroy even the strongest partnerships. The men who had saved Western civilization together could not save their own friendship from the corrosive effects of politics and pride. Their legacy is both their triumph in war and their failure in peace, both their demonstration of democratic leadership at its finest and their illustration of its ultimate limitations. The silence that began on Inauguration Day 1953 and lasted until death separated them forever stands as one of the great tragic ironies of American political history. Two men who understood better than anyone the importance of collaboration and mutual respect in democratic governance spent their final years demonstrating the opposite. Their estrangement weakened American leadership precisely when strength was most needed, deprived the nation of their combined wisdom precisely when wisdom was most valuable, and illustrated the human cost of political ambition precisely when unity was most necessary. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.